Hey, ladies and gents, here we are back for the third and final installment in the Chapter 1 lecture videos. This should only take about an hour and 15 minutes or so. What we need to do now is review some of the terms that we'll be using throughout the year. So we need to have sort of a common set of terms we can use to describe, structures of the body, regions of the body, directions for like cuts of dissection, things of that nature. So first, we'll start with what's referred to as anatomical position. So with anatomical position, the subject or the person is standing facing you. Their arms are straight down at their sides, palms facing the front. Their feet are parallel to one another. Okay, so they're basically standing their arms down facing you. The key part to remember with this, and this is what people have trouble with time and again, is that when we talk about right or left, we're talking about the organism's right and left, not yours. So since they're facing you, whoops, sorry, the downside of doing stuff at home, my kids start barking. Um, yeah, so when we talk about right and left, we're talking about the organisms right and left. So just make sure that in reference to stuff, because this will matter on quizzes and tests, when we talk about right and left, you're paying attention to their right and left. They're facing you, so it's going to be the opposite. Okay, when we think about the body, we think of it being pretty solid, right? But in reality, the body is filled with spaces. What's a cavity? When you think about cavity, you might think of like stuff that's in your teeth, right? But cavities are spaces. So throughout the body, there are all sorts of cavities and spaces. Now, it's not like you walk around with a bunch of empty space up there. It gets filled with organs, okay? So the body creates cavities. Those cavities are filled with organs, and those organs do different jobs to make the organ systems work and make you run, okay? So there are two broad categories of cavities. The first is the dorsal cavity. The dorsal cavity is basically the cranial cavity where your brain is, and the spinal cavity where your spinal cord is. Okay, so dorsal means toward the back. Think about the dorsal fin on the fish. So the dorsal cavities, again, contain the cranial cavity and the spinal cavity for your brain and spinal cord. Ventral means belly side. So the ventral cavity has a lot of different organs in it. The ventral cavity includes the thoracic cavity and then the abdominal pelvic cavity. The thorax is basically your chest. Now, it'll subdivide into other categories for different organs, but your chest, in essence, holds your heart and your lungs. The abdominal pelvic cavity has a lot of your gut organs, your stomach, your liver, your intestines, your spleen, kidneys, things of that nature. And then down in the pelvic cavity, you'll have like the bladder, uterus, things of that nature. Okay, so the ventral cavities house a lot of gut organs. The dorsal cavity houses the brain and spinal cord. And again, you have various organs in there for those different jobs. All right, so let's jump right into all the terms. You'll definitely need to get these terms memorized because we're going to be using them throughout the year. First, what we're going to do is talk about regions of the body. There are a ton of terms in the book that you can look at. What I'm wanting to hit here are just some of the terms that are maybe a little less obvious, so it's worth going over them. First is antecubital. Ante means before. So the antecubital region is the front of the elbow. This ends up being an important part for receiving shots and things of that nature. So antecubital is the front of the elbow. The popliteal region is the back of the knee. The way I can remember this, not that you should ever do it, but I don't know if you've ever seen somebody, they go and they sort of pop somebody in the back of the knee and they sort of lose their balance a little bit. So I just remember you pop them in the popliteal region. Yeah, my son is referencing that. So the popliteal region, you pop them in the popliteal region, the back of the knee. Please don't. The patellar region. The patella is the anatomical term for your kneecap. So the patellar region is the front of the knee. Anything carpal is in reference to the wrist. You think of like carpal tunnel syndrome. So carpal means wrist, like your carpal bones are in your wrist. Inguinal means groin. So the inguinal region is basically where the thigh meets the trunk of the body. Thoracic, we mentioned that. That means chest. And then digital, your digis, are your fingers and your toes. Okay, these directional terms. Again, we'll need to know these. If we'll come up with a vaccine and we've got dissection going on in the spring, we'll definitely need to know these directional terms. So the first term we'll look at is superior. Superior doesn't mean better than, it means above. Think of like Lake Superior. I don't know that it's necessarily better than Lake Huron, but it is at a higher latitude. So superior means toward the head or toward the top. Inferior doesn't mean worse than. In this instance, it means toward the feet. Anterior is toward the front, again, that anti again, and posterior is toward the back. Think of like people referring to as the backside as the posterior. Medial means toward the midline, so that's like medial middle. Lateral means toward the side, away from the midline of the body. Now, proximal and distal, these are two terms that we need to use in reference to the appendages. So you could say, if a person's standing there, that the elbow is, let me get in this position here, the elbow is superior to the wrist. But what if we do this? Oh, it just changed, right? So superior, inferior can change pretty easily in the appendages. So we use a different set of terms, proximal and distal. When we talk about proximal and distal, we're talking about its relation to the attachment point with the body. So if something is proximal, it's closer to the attachment point of the body. I think it's like close proximity. It's closer to the attachment point of the body. If it's distal, that means it's further from the attachment point of the body. So distal, I think it's long distance. It's farther and farther away from where things attach. So you would say your wrist is distal to your elbow. So your wrist is farther from the attachment point of the body than your elbow. You would say your wrist is proximal to your fingers. So the wrist is closer to the attachment point than the fingers. So again, you can move the appendage and the relationship to the attachment point stays the same. So we only use proximal distal when we're talking about the appendages. Next, we're going to look at the terms superficial and deep. Superficial, like the name implies, is toward the surface. So, a structure can be superficial, maybe be closer to the surface of the body, like certain layers of the skin. And then deep just means it's further from the surface of the body. So, so one organ may be deep to another organ. We do have, and I'll put this up in the chapter 1 materials on the homepage. We do have a little 3D model here. We used some VR stuff to make this model. So thank you to C3PO for his work. But you can sort of move this around. Here you see medial is toward the midline of the body, lateral is away from the midline, superior is toward the head, inferior is away from the head. Anterior is toward the front, posterior is toward the back. Here we're looking at an appendage. We look at the arm. Distal is further from the attachment point. Proximal is closer to the attachment point. And then superficial is more on the surface, and deep is deeper. Okay. Let's see. Make sure I got this. Okay. Next, we're going to look at the planes of dissection. Now, when you cut, you're cutting through space, right? You're moving the blade through space. And so we need to name the types of cuts that can be made so that when doing a dissection, you make cuts sort of traveling through the tissue in the right direction. So the first type of plane of dissection that we'll look at is a sagittal plane. I just think the sagittal splits into right and left. Okay, so here you see the sagittal plane. It cuts the organism into right and left pieces. The frontal plane, also called the coronal plane, but the frontal plane does what the name implies. It cuts the organism into front and back pieces. And then finally, the transverse section. This can be pretty easy to remember. Transverse cuts the organism into top and bottom sections. Sometimes you just call it cross section. You probably more commonly hear it referred to it as that. So again, sagittal splits you into right and left. Frontal cuts you into front and back. And then transverse cuts you into top and bottom. And I think we got another model here. Really get to see my 3D drawing skills. There we go. So again, you see the sagittal plane. Notice it's the scary blue person's right and the scary blue person's left. Transverse cuts them into top and bottom pieces. And then in purple here, you see the frontal or coronal plane, cut them into front and back pieces. Okay, what else we got here? So if you look at this image of a brain, what they've done is they basically cut it, and what you're doing is looking at the right side of the brain. Okay, so it's this portion of the brain, cut it down the middle, and then you're looking at the right side. So what type of cut would that be? Standard educational practice is 10 seconds away time. So you got your 10 seconds. That is a sagittal cut. So remember, sagittal cuts you into right and left pieces. So if you're looking at the right hemisphere of the brain, that was made by a sagittal cut. All right, so what I would suggest you do is take just a brief amount of time to go and summarize some of the big ideas from these notes. I tried to chunk the videos into these sections to sort of hit the big ideas, but use that as a guide for stuff we're going to be doing next week. Have a great day.